Hey Vix, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatore and Eastern Antique Arms, and I've just acquired a new old sword, an antique sword that is new to me, that's rather unusual, so I'm going to show it to you. But first of all, I'm going to set the context. That didn't take me many seconds, did it? Just by showing what is a normal blade from 1845 onwards. So you can see it's very slightly curved, but almost straight, and it is fullered. That is, it has a blood groove, not a blood groove. It has a groove up the blade in order to increase the rigidity in relation to the amount of mass in the blade. Okay, so it's a bit like an H or I beam, or girder as you like to call it. So it increases stiffness whilst not increasing mass. This style of fullered blade was made regulation for officers, British officers, in 1845. Prior to that, they had had pipe-backed blades, which had evolved from this broad-bladed type and had become, as the example above, narrower. And a pipe-backed blade, as you can see, has a rod up the back with a relatively flat section to the blade. Pipe-backs tend to be not great at cutting, not great at thrusting. For that reason, in the age of pipe backs, so between 1822 and 1845, we do sometimes find other blade types used by officers who didn't want a pipe back, they wanted something else. In addition to that, once the fullered type blade came in 1845, not all officers liked these either, and so some officers got different styles of blade, and that's what I'm going to be showing you on this new acquisition of mine. And so here it is. It's rather unusual in two main aspects. Number one, it is longer than normal. In fact, three main aspects. Number one, it's longer than normal. Number two, it has no fuller. Number three, it's more curved than normal. So again, we look at the usual proportions of blade here. Incidentally, I should mention, this one is not, it wasn't the best example for me to pick. It's not completely typical because this is actually slightly longer than normal. So ignore the length disparity because these are actually they're both longer than normal. But you can see that the one below, the new one, which I'm going to focus on now, is broader and more curved, and of course lacks the fuller. And in that sense, you could liken it maybe to a tulwar, and it's possible that notice the tulwar is shorter. So this is a 33, even more than that, 33.5 inch blade. The tulwar in this case is only, I think, about 29 or 30 inches. But actually, it might even be less than that looking at it. It might be 28. So you could say that that this sword was inspired by tulwars, and it would be very tempting, and it might be correct to say that this was for a British officer serving in India, or we must clarify, an Indian officer, because remember that Indian officers serving under British command wore the same uniforms and used the same swords as British officers. They were essentially British officers, it's just that they were ethnically Indian. So in some cases, indeed, we do find actual tulwar blades on British hilts, and you know, this Wootz example behind me is one that for understandable reasons attracted a fair amount of attention. So it goes all the way back into the 18th century. That's probably from about 1810, something like that. But all the way back into the 18th century, Europeans recognised the quality of Indian blades, and some really liked Indian blades, and so they mounted Indian blades onto their regulation hilts. But that's not what this is. There are certain things about this blade that give it away as probably not being an Indian blade. What is it? I'm not entirely sure. It could have been made in India, but it's not what I would describe as a tulwar blade. It's kind of longer than most tulwars are. It's the way the distal taper goes. It's very thick at the base here and then tapers down quite quickly. It's quite actually quite a thin and springy blade. And it also has a beveled false edge at the back here, which some tulwars, except some tulwars, do in fact have something similar to a yelman on a Turkish kilich, but that doesn't seem to be what this is. This seems to be a precursor to what was later offered in the 1850s and 1860s, and in some cases later, by Wilkinson, by the Wilkinson Company, which I have an example of here. I have shown this sword before, and this type of blade is called the lenticular blade. Now, this isn't as broad and it isn't as curved, but you'll see that the blade is lenticular shaped. So it's not a wedge, okay? So it's not a straight wedge like this. It's kind of like, almost like a teardrop, okay? It's not double-edged. It does have an edge at the front, and then it swells towards the back, and then it gets a bit narrow again, almost a bit like looking like at a boat or a yacht from above. Now, in contrast to that, I have here another Wilkinson sword from the 1850s, which features an unfullered blade, but this is known as the flat solid blade, and this is a wedge section. This is actually quite like a naval cutlass in cross section, and that may have been the inspiration for it. Okay, so it's not like that. It's not the flat solid. So coming back to the main sword, so this is unusual in several ways. It is broader, it is slightly longer, it is unfullered. I'm not entirely sure what to make of this yet. Now, the blade does need some cleaning. When I initially saw photographs of this sword, I purchased it from a fellow dealer. I did wonder if it was a Wootz blade. Now, as you guys know, I am always on the hunt for Wootz. This is my mission in life. I'm trying to track. Wow, it's a bit sharp. I haven't actually cut myself, but I almost did. It's quite sharp, this blade, and it is very clearly been sharpened and honed many times. And it does have a couple of little nicks in the edge there. I don't know if you'll be able to see that. I would guess that this is an officer's campaign sword. Whether it was an officer serving in India or whether it was done for the Crimean War, I can somewhat date this sword. So first of all, normally with swords we can date them somewhat by the details of the blade. This blade doesn't give us any clues. It's a plain blade, it's unfullered, it's a non-regulation style, so we can't by itself date the blade, but we can date the hilt. First of all, it's the 1822 pattern hilt, that being a gilt brass hilt here with a floral decorated backstrap, and it's in the 1822 style. But it has the monarch's cipher here, and in this case it's VR, not VRI, so because that would be later, which would be the Indian imperial title for Victoria, but VR is Victoria Regina, okay? So that is Queen Victoria. So we know that this dates to, she came onto the throne in 1837, and there's another detail in this hilt. It has a folding inner drop, as it's called. We can call it a flap, okay? And that type of drop, some books will tell you that went out of use in 1854. That's incorrect. It did not go out of use in 1854. I have owned numerous Wilkinson-made examples of these swords that date to after 1854, which still have the folding section. And in fact, I know a friend of mine has an example dating from the 1880s with a folding inner section, but that admittedly is a picket weight or dress sword. Generally speaking, my observation is that certainly Wilkinson and the other companies I'm familiar with stopped doing this folding section in around 1860. So literally I've owned examples from 1859 which have this, and in 1860 that becomes one solid piece. Why did it become one solid piece? Quite simply because it's stronger. These often got broken, and in real life, if you were attacked and had to suddenly pull your sword out, you wouldn't have time to deploy that usually anyway. It would probably just stay there. So it's kind of pointless. Yes, it makes the sword more comfortable to wear when it's against your side, and it means that it's less likely to wear your uniform. But you need, if you're having a sword, if you're wearing a sword, it may as well be a sword that works. So the folding section is kind of superfluous. Now, there are some other clues about this. This is a fairly substantial one. So my observation is that the brass hilts tend to become more substantial in the 1850s. The 1840s examples, in my opinion, are generally speaking more dainty, should we say, a little bit more fragile. This is a relatively thick guard. No sign of any maker's marks or anything like that, so no clues there. But I would say this dates to about 1850. Most dealers would agree. that's a good estimate of this, saying it probably dates to the 1850s, between 1850 and 1860. So what does that put us in the time of? It puts us in the time of the Sikh Wars, the Crimean War, and the Indian Mutiny. So I think that this is probably a specially ordered sword, could be by either a British or an Indian officer serving in India. Might not be, might be by an officer serving in Europe or Africa, somewhere else, who wanted a blade that they considered was a more serious fighting blade than the typical one. So they've got a broader and more curved blade, and it's certainly got a very, very good edge on it, and there's almost no secondary bevel. So for those of you who know about knives and swords, you'll know that generally speaking there's your blade will come to an edge and then there's a secondary bevel right at the edge. This, much like a katana or certain types of Indian sword, or indeed medieval European swords, has no secondary bevel, maybe a little bit of appleseed edge. So this is going to be a superb cutter, superb chopper. And this is very much a sword that was chosen by someone who believed in the cut over the thrust, I would say, because this is not a particularly... Yes, you could stab someone with it, you could run someone through with it probably, but if they're wearing thick clothing, that is a relatively flexible blade and a relatively spatulate or broad tip. The upside of that, whilst it's worse at penetrating with a thrust, it is better at cutting right up at the tip, because you've still got breadth up there and still got some mass up there, and the edge geometry is quite thin and flat. So it's still going to cut effectively right up near the tip. So you've got good reach with this, good cutting capacity. It's a nice, solid, beefy sword. A really, really nice piece. I'm very, very happy with it. So I am going to clean this blade up. I very, very much doubt that there's it's not Wootz. I'm certain it's not Wootz. It could possibly be a pattern welded blade. I don't know. It might be a simple, straightforward steel blade. I hope that's been interesting to you. I like to show interesting objects when I acquire them, and that will probably be living in my collection for a while. Once I've cleaned it up, once I've done some work and maybe had a little bit more thinking about it, I may do an update video just to share more thoughts about that sword, because it is an interesting piece and I've not had one exactly like that before. Hope this has been interesting. See you for the next video. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. We have extra videos on Patreon and you can follow us on Facebook.